Hello, I'm Robyn Taylor from Open Lab at Newcastle University, and this is Jocelyn Spence from the Mixed Reality Lab at University of Nottingham. We're here today to present a piece of research that we've put together with our colleagues Brendan Walker, Bettina Nissen, and Peter Wright. In this presentation, Jocelyn and I are exploring how human-computer interaction research can literally be performed, and not in the sense of using performance to present or communicate research results, but actually as a unique method of conducting experience-centered design research in a reflective, self-situated way. This method of exploration draws from the worlds of performance theory, human-computer interaction design, and practice-based research. In today's presentation, we will introduce the role of performer researcher and illustrate how conducting HCI research through self-situated performance can be a useful method of practice. To aid our discussion, we'll make reference to 4 projects drawn from the HCI literature that we, the authors, have directly taken part in as performer researchers ourselves. We'll then propose 4 contributions to human-computer interaction that we suggest the performer researcher is ideally placed to explore.
So the definition is, the performer researcher is a practitioner who conducts design research by staging and taking part in participatory performance in order to make sense of shared experience. Performer researchers have a unique vantage point for conducting their research. In terms of Goffman's frame analysis, they're inside the frame that they've constructed. This means they can be reflexive about their work as it unfolds. And in terms of performance theory, you can think about oscillation. These performer researchers are oscillating between their role of performer and the role of researcher, and also between the goals of performance and the goals of research. We're engaging the public in a shared act in front of the public. To begin our discussion, we've gathered 4 examples drawn from our own published work in HCI. We argue that each of the examples has a performer researcher who uses performance or performative skills to conduct HCI research, and that this opens up new possibilities.
So our first example, Human Aquarium, most closely resembles what a layperson might consider a performance. It's a live musical performance. So to make this, I worked very closely with Guy Schofield and John Shearer, as well as numerous other people at Newcastle University. We toured Human Aquarium internationally, and we performed it for about 2 years. So during performances, Guy and I improvised musical content. So I sang, I'm a classical soprano, and Guy played a variety of synthesizers and acoustic instruments. Audiences were invited to approach the Human Aquarium, which had a touch-sensitive, transparent face. And their touches then affected the sound of our music making and some visual and lighting effects. So together, this allowed the audience to jam with us. So the primary goal of this performance project was to make sense of social encounters with technology by auto-ethnographically examining our own experiences taking part in the Human Aquarium performances themselves. In a sense, Guy and John and I were the subjects of this investigation, exploring how the experiences we had with the public were affected as we evolved the project and made modifications and refinements to the performance content in response to the audience interactions that we experienced firsthand.
Now this is the thrill engineer, otherwise known as Brendan Walker. He creates and studies thrilling experiences like putting people on an intense amusement park ride and then broadcasting their images and their biodata while they're at their most terrified. He doesn't set up his research as a theatrical experience. Instead, he relies on a more conversational, social sort of approach. But he uses this big, stylized showman sort of persona of the thrill engineer to help people make sense of his projects. He uses this persona as an orchestrator to help people get interested in taking part. And then the thrill engineer as orchestrator also does a lot of the work in creating the sense of excitement and anticipation that he goes on to study.
As a third example, we present the public making practice of Bettina Nissen. Nissen's a designer, and her practice engages the public in participatory fabrication activities that algorithmically translate their lived experiences into small physical souvenirs that she calls data things, digitally crafted items imbued with participants' personal stories and personal meanings. She suggests that making visible the practices of makers affords the public a greater appreciation and understanding of the bespoke data things that she creates. Her live, situated performance of making helps transform them, in the sense described by Tim Ingold, from objects into things.
The fourth example is the rough mile, which is I'll talk about part of this locative audio walk. We wanted our participants to get into an emotionally charged frame of mind. And one of the main ways we accomplished this was to blur the lines between reality and fiction. And one of the main ways we did this was to make sure that I was the one who took each participant from the upstairs consent gathering researchy area down to street level where the performance itself began. And when we did that, I started to explain to them what we're really trying to do here. And so they got a sense that they knew a bit of what was coming and it might be real. And then on top of that, I was the narrator of the locative audio walk experience. And if you're not a native speaker, I promise you cannot miss this accent in England. And on top of that, we used bone conducting headphones. So instead of just listening, the sound was conducted through the cheekbones, and it sounded like my voice was coming from inside their skulls. Slightly terrifying. So the participants never knew how much of the story they were hearing might be true, and several of them actually reacted as if it were true. So in the rough mile, I was both a researcher and a technologically mediated performer, and this combination helped to shape the research we did.
So these 4 projects are projects that we, the authors, were actively involved in, functioning as performer researchers ourselves. We got together and we identified 4 ways in that we suggest self-situated performance research can contribute to the practice of human-computer interaction design.
So the first of these is the ability to develop intimacy through situatedness and trust, because performance is not all about jazz hands and staging Hamlet. You have some things like the work of the late Adrian Howells. So in this example, he washed the feet of each audience member one at a time, something very different than what you would get on Broadway or in the West End. Self-situated performance research can make use of this kind of performance to create a sharply heightened attention to what exactly the performer researcher is doing and what they, as the audience, are expected to do in return. This applies to physically participatory work like there, or just ones where the audience knows that they're being seen. Oh, me again. I remember coming across Human Aquarium and feeling really intensely overwhelmed by Robyn's presence. The people around me were completely absorbed in meeting her gaze, touching her fingers through the glass, and doing that to control the interface. It felt very exciting, but very demanding. And even with dozens of people around, it was an intimate kind of interaction that's extremely unusual in research practice. Now, we can design exactly how we situate ourselves with our audience to actively encourage trust, immediacy, and intimacy. And this can be incredibly important for research that looks at felt experience or that tries to create opportunities for novel types of interaction. Even without a live performer, you can use technology carefully to create this kind of intimacy, like the bone-conducting headphones in the rough mile.
So the second way in which we feel self-situated performance research contributes to HCI practice is that it allows researchers to make sense of an encounter intuitively from within our own creative practice. So in this example, we see Bettina, who doesn't identify as an artist per se, but who has a long-standing practice of making. She understands data through her experience as a maker and as a facilitator of making experiences. So here she is talking a participant through the data thing that she has crafted to make sense of the participant's involvement in a series of annual marathon events. Bettina wanted to know more about what participation in these marathons meant to people in the communities of Northeast England. So when she made the data thing, Bettina looked at each participant's marathon running times and statistics, physically representing how each of the participants' runs had unfolded through the years. Bettina described to me how using her creative practice to craft the physicality of the data thing allowed her to access a sort of tacit understanding of the relationship between the numeric data and the lived experience of the participant. And this went beyond an understanding of the numbers or the physicality of the resulting artifact. It was the doing of the practice and the sharing of the data thing in the live encounter that enabled her to elicit these rich personal stories from community participants. She used the insights that her craft practice allowed her to intuit. I encountered this as well with my experiences with Human Aquarium. I encountered this as well with my experiences with Human Aquarium. Using my performance skills that I developed over 20 years of live performance, I'm able to work in a different way as a musician than I do as an academic. I understand things differently, and I use a different skill set to connect and engage with participants, intuiting what they might want to share with me and how they might want or expect me to respond. So these are the skills musicians use when jamming with one another. Having the opportunity to bring these kind of skills into my experience-centered interaction design research allowed me to access a whole different realm of my own knowing, an intuitive, a holistic. Sorry, I'm obviously having technical difficulties. Basically, through working as a performer researcher, I had access to understand the encounter as a musician, not as an academic. And I was able to unlock a very different set of insights about the challenges. What's going on? Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry. So let me get back to it. So working as a performer researcher, I was able to unlock insights into the social encounters I was experiencing by engaging in creative practice, and it would have been a much different challenge to identify these things purely through intellect or empirical observation.
A little out of breath now. The third thing that self-situated performance research offers to HCI is a unique way of shaping the spectator's relationship to the research. So 100 years ago, a famous artist took a urinal, signed a fake name to it, and stuck it in an art gallery. Now, you could argue that the urinal on the right is no more artistic than the one on the left, but I think that the people who've been making money off of this for a century would disagree with you. By putting our research in a different context, we can invite people to interact with it in a different way, and possibly one that's more helpful for our aims. So, you can imagine Brendan Walker skulking around, asking people, "Would you please take part in my research?" You'd probably get a very different result than what you get from the thrill engineer, Brendan Walker, getting you really excited and all fired up about being lucky enough to take part in one of his projects. To our knowledge, no one has ever directly compared two approaches like these, but it's hard to imagine that you would get the same quantity and quality of response between the timid Brendan, hypothetical timid Brendan, and the actual thrill engineer. As another example, we could have presented the Rough Mile as a locative audio walk that we wanted some feedback on, and we would have gotten some feedback, I'm sure. But instead, we set ourselves up in a music store. Oh, I'm still out of breath, sorry. Which was an important subject of our research, and then we created this ambiguous context where the audio they were listening to might easily have been real. This contributed to most of our participants responding to the project in a very personal way. They got absorbed in the aesthetics of the experience, and they felt moments of intense emotional connection. So context really can be everything.
And our final suggestion is that self-situated performance research allows the performer researcher to continually devise and co-create their research even as it's taking place. Conducting research in the field with the public allows the researcher the opportunity to respond and react to unfolding live events. And that is, of course, true for many forms of research in the wild. But what makes self-situated performance particularly helpful in this context is the opportunity to intentionally design aesthetic experiences that are, as we described it in our Human Aquarium writings, intentionally, simultaneously finished and unfinished. I would describe it as creating a creative space that's intended to become inhabited during live performance, when audience interaction completes the performance frame by engaging with the performer researcher and making real the encounter. For example, Brendan Walker has a fabulous quote for us describing how performance gives him a chance to improvise and respond to the unpredictability of research in the wild. His participants are often hundreds of feet in the air on crazy thrill rides, and under live performance conditions, their transmitted medical data would often patch in and out, so making it look as if they might be in grave danger. Now, instead of being a problem, Brendan then saw the potential in this and described this as an aesthetic benefit, building it into his performance practice in order to intensify the experience for the onlooking spectators. And he'd be like, is the subject still alive or are they dead? The data might have been of low fidelity, but he said that in performance terms, it was a real treat to be able to work that with a real audience. So as a performer researcher, he was able to take the variances of live research in the wild and use it to devise a new and improvised avenue of inquiry, how the audience would react to the illusion of real danger in response to the unfolding of unplanned live events.
So the performer researcher has the ability and the responsibility to tell a unique and truthful story that can only be known from the perspective of someone who was there, inside the encounter, making sense of their own lived experience. The ideas that we've distilled come about from practitioners exploring their own practice. And we believe that this type of work is happening at an opportune time, too. Last year in Interactions magazine, the Bard Zells called out for humanistic HCI, using the voice of the researcher as the expert subject in academic research. But of course, the intuitive, pragmatic ways in which the performer researchers work often challenge the expectations of communities like CHI.
So we conclude our discussion with 2 questions to take forward. What can we learn about the real world from making art? And how can the work of performer researchers be used within conventional academic research teams? We believe that we can approach an answer to the first question by championing small-scale and unrepeatable events. Research practices aiming to make sense of the nuances of lived experience need not be, and in fact possibly should not be, uniformly generalizable in order to be deemed capable of generating a deep understanding of personal experience. Interventions that depend on the physical presence of the researcher may in fact be preferable in terms of eliciting intimate and multifaceted understandings of shared experience.
Performer researchers can work in conventional academic research team easily if we demystify the creative process. There are many ways of integrating performance into collaborative research practice. We don't have to put the artists or the performance-oriented skills in a silo. Makers of technologically mediated performance have a perspective that bridges concerns of interaction design, technology, experience research, data capture, and ethnography, in addition to art production. And many researchers who don't identify as artists may have the skills that would support self-situated research. We're having more issues, sorry.
I apologize.
So we'll just, yes.
So basically...
We're almost done, so I don't know what else to say.
No, basically, so interventions that depend on the presence of the researcher, while they might require, one-to-one intimate personal intervention rather than something that could be farmed out to a team of supportive helpers and collaborators, can still give us some insights that would be very difficult to unpick using more conventional means.
Or that maybe couldn't be accessed at all.
So we'd like to just close by giving you some links to the published projects we used. We have many great memories of working with all of these people, and we'd really like to thank the teams of collaborators that worked with us.
Especially those who are here today.
Yes, so I hope we have time for a question or two.
Michael Muller, IBM Research. I really like this, thank you. I'm going to try to take it home and tell people, and some of them are going to go, oh, but that's just like what anthropologists do. I don't believe that's true, but I would love to carry your answer back to them. In the sense that an anthropologist goes into a situation, maybe role-playing and participant observation, is not being her or himself.
I think that might be the slight difference, though, is that it isn't really role play and not being ourselves. I mean, we are extending ourselves into sometimes a more, at least in these examples we've got here, we are extending ourselves, but you are still, when you're working with me in Human Aquarium, you are still engaging with me. Just a different aspect of me than is the researcher me. It's sort of in my opinion, my more fundamental self that I would use in my sort of passion work in music. So I would say that I'm not putting on a role per se, neither would be even Brendan or Jocelyn or Bettina, but we're just sort of enhancing who we are rather than trying to anthropologically jump into something that isn't intuitive to us.
We all contain multitudes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I'd also like to just add that what we were talking about oscillation, that it's not that you adopt a different role or drop one role, but that you immediately sort of slide between the two. And also that an anthropologist, to my understanding, is attempting to study something out there, whereas we are attempting to study two sides of a performance experience, partly from our own lived experience in the role of performer, and then partly from what we can understand through other means about what the audience sees.
Hi, Chris Ellison from Open Lab, Newcastle University. It's so great. It really just sitting there resonates with so many things that I've been thinking about for a while. My question is about the the ways in which, so with a lot of sort of performance speculative approaches, sometimes you're asking participants to suspend their disbelief and that they are role-playing and playing along. In my own research, I've become very interested in giving people very visceral and real experiences, so they're not just playing along. And I wondered if you could just reflect on, is that the case here? And if so, you know, does it matter that they're suspending disbelief? Like, can you just be convincing enough, or do you need to give them real, consequential kind of experiences? Does that make sense?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, you go first.
I know that in my own work, I tend to think in terms of setting parameters rather than trying to make something happen. For example, in the Rough Mile, we didn't have the goal of making people suspend their disbelief, but we set parameters in which that became possible. So that isn't a real full answer, but that's how I tend to think of things like that.
So I think we're going to have to leave it at that. Thank you so much for your patience with the technical issues.